The research that Boston Mountain ultimately developed and commercialized was a collaboration between me, my major professor in engineering, Bob Beidel, his collaborator and one of my committee members, Ralph Henry, who's in biology, and then my advisor's advisor at the University of Pittsburgh, Mohammed Attai, and his current graduate student, Patrick Bartlow. So we had like 3 generations of students, I suppose you could say. Boston Mountain was formed entirely to commercialize the technology I was working on in graduate school. The technology is specifically to reduce the manufacturing costs for IV and injectable drugs. So the short little pitch is we don't make drugs, we make drugs cheaper. So, because we're engineers. When you manufacture specifically IV and injectable drugs, so we're talking about protein therapeutics, those are use a microorganism to produce your therapeutic. And the most similar way to think about it would be like the way they make beer right now. You use yeast and then all of your wort to make beer. Unlike with beer, when we keep the liquid, when pharmaceuticals are made, you keep the solids. And so you're trying to use that microorganism to make the therapeutic of choice. On a good day, that microorganism makes about 10% drug and about 90% just other garbage. The FDA obviously says we can't inject people with stuff that's not clean. And so the pharmaceutical industry spends about $8 billion annually purifying from that 10% to the 99.99% purity that the FDA requires. I figured out how to analyze the genetics of the microorganism that we were using to encourage it to make more drug and less contaminant. So you can actually boost the productivity of the whole manufacturing process by actually just turning off genes that it doesn't need to be using, so it's making less garbage in the first place. I was, I think, in my 3rd year of graduate school, and I kind of got roped into Carol's class on accident. It was it's an amusing story. They were doing all the patent analysis, trying to find technologies for her student team's license. And she had 2 interns, and one of the interns happened to be one of my really good friends and roommates from undergrad, who called me and said, we're reading, and she had a background in creative writing. She's like, I'm reading all these patents, and I have no idea what like the science is. We've talked to Carol. Do you think you'd come in as the 3rd intern and help us read patents? And doing a lot of laboratory research that we were working with chromatography machines, you have to kind of babysit the machine, but it does the research while you sit there. I was like, well, I'll talk to my major professor. I'll see if I can read patents while the machines run. And so that's kind of how I actually got into Carol's program, was reading and evaluating patents. And kind of just this led to that, and finally we were looking at this technology, and Dr. Beidel and I had applied to the National Science Foundation for the I-Corps program. We had been invited to participate in the I-Corps program, and Carol was like, well, if you're going to do the I-Corps program, you really should just like go ahead and take the technology and do new venture development with me as well. And Beidel was crazy enough to let me do it all simultaneously, and yeah, so I went through the whole new venture development class with Carol's program, and very quickly learned that scientists don't do a great job of communicating what we do to the real world. So she spent a lot of time working with me on that. It officially started in 2013, right after I graduated. I started as chief science officer. My dad was our CEO, because I was the CEO in training. It made more sense at that point. We were doing a lot of fundraising. He had the experience. He comes from an M&A background, and so he had all of the experience and the leadership, and so I was more CEO in training was probably a good title for me at that point. We went through the process of doing private funding, so we did all private convertible debt notes, got the lab up and running, hired my first employee, which was the gal who worked with me in graduate school. And got as much research done as we could and applied for federal grants. Finally, were awarded a NSF Phase 1. So we worked on that with a partnership with North Carolina State. Kind of packaged up the technology. I feel like I'm like, wow, that whole time span went really fast. And packaged up the technology really nicely, and now we're working on selling it. Much like a lot of science companies, you get things through certain risk stages and then it needs to be moved on to somebody who can actually use it. So for ours, for example, it has to be leveraged by a drug manufacturing company. And that's not a step that I really want to take with Boston Mountain to build a drug manufacturing facility. So it's a really, really, really large capital raise into a very competitive market. And so in terms of just strategy, it makes more sense to sell the IP to an existing company as opposed to try to go through all of that